It has been many years since I first walked beside my dear friend Sherlock Holmes through the quiet streets of London. Time has softened many memories, yet some remain as clear as the glow of a fireplace on a winter evening. There are adventures that gently fade into history, and there are others that never lose their place within the heart. This is one such recollection. Even now, as I sit in peaceful reflection, I can almost hear the distant rumble of carriage wheels upon damp cobblestones. I can picture the warm light shining through the familiar windows of Baker Street, while London itself drifted beneath its endless curtain of mist. Those quiet evenings often promised conversation, music from Holmes's violin, and mysteries that waited patiently beyond our door. Yet the story I now recall began during a very different season of my life. 3 years had passed since the terrible events beside the Reichenbach Falls. The world believed Sherlock Holmes had perished there in his final struggle with Professor Moriarty. I believed it too. No sorrow had ever settled more deeply upon my heart. Life continued, as life always must. I devoted myself to my medical practice and sought comfort in useful work. The passing days eased the sharpest edge of grief, though they never removed it entirely. Often, when I encountered a strange medical case or read of an unusual crime, I would catch myself wondering what Holmes might have observed. His remarkable mind had left such a lasting impression upon me that I could not help measuring every mystery against the standard he had set. None, however, stirred my thoughts as deeply as the death of the Honorable Ronald Adair. The case had captured the attention of every newspaper in London. Gentlemen discussed it within their clubs. Servants whispered about it in kitchens. Policemen puzzled over every detail. The more one examined the facts, the less sense it appeared to make. Ronald Adair was a young gentleman of excellent reputation. He was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, whose family had recently returned from Australia. Their residence stood at 427 Park Lane, among the grand houses that overlooked Hyde Park. Those who knew Mr. Adair described him as quiet, respectable, yet polite. He had no enemies that anyone could name. He lived a comfortable life, enjoyed respectable company, and possessed no habits that might have drawn dangerous attention toward him. His favorite pastime was playing cards. Unlike reckless gamblers, he was considered cautious. He belonged to several distinguished clubs where whist was regularly played. Sometimes he won respectable sums. Sometimes he lost modest amounts, yet nothing suggested financial difficulty. His fortune was more than sufficient to cover any ordinary loss. Only a few weeks before his death, he and one particular playing partner had won several £100 during a successful evening at cards. No one thought much of it at the time. On the evening of March 30th, Mr. Adair returned home shortly after 10 o'clock. His mother and sister had gone out for the evening, leaving the house unusually quiet. A servant heard him enter his sitting room on the second floor. Earlier, she had lit the fire there, although the chimney smoked enough that she had opened the window to clear the room. Nothing seemed unusual. No cries were heard. No visitors arrived. No disturbance reached the ears of anyone within the house. Nearly an hour later, Lady Maynooth and her daughter returned home. Wishing to bid Ronald good night, they climbed the stairs and found the door to his sitting room locked from the inside. They knocked. There was no reply. They called his name. Still there was only silence. At last the servants forced open the door. The scene they discovered shocked every person who later heard of it. Ronald Adair lay dead beside his writing table. A single terrible wound to his head had ended his life instantly. yet no weapon could be found anywhere inside the room. Upon the table rested several neat piles of money, consisting of banknotes, silver, and gold. Beside them lay a sheet of paper covered with figures and the names of several gentlemen from his card club. It appeared he had been calmly calculating his recent winnings and losses before death had interrupted him. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been disturbed. The room itself offered almost no explanation. The door had unquestionably been locked from within. The open window overlooked the street below, yet the ground outside showed no footprints. Beneath the window bloomed delicate crocuses that remained perfectly untouched. No one had climbed in, nor had anyone climbed out. The distance from the window to the ground was considerable, and there was neither pipe nor ledge that might assist an intruder. The bullet had entered with deadly precision, but no witness recalled hearing the sound of a gunshot. This puzzled the investigators more than anything else. Park Lane was never truly silent. Carriages passed throughout the evening. Cab drivers waited nearby. Pedestrians walked beneath the gas lamps long after dark. Surely someone should have heard firearm discharged, yet no one had. Little did I know where those impossible facts would eventually lead. During my daily rounds as a physician, I found the mystery returning to my thoughts again and again. I tried, almost as an exercise of memory, to imitate Holmes's methods. I examined each known fact separately before attempting to unite them into a single explanation. Why had the young man locked the door? Why was the money left untouched? How could a fatal shot have been fired without anyone hearing it? Why had a gentleman with no known enemies been selected as the victim? Each answer seemed only to create another question. I confess that my efforts achieved little success. As the afternoon faded into evening, I found myself walking almost without purpose through Hyde Park until my steps naturally carried me toward Park Lane itself. The spring air remained cool, and a gentle mist had already begun gathering beneath the street lamps. London possessed a peaceful beauty at that hour, though beneath its calm appearance there always lingered a quiet possibility of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Now, when I reached number 427, I discovered a small gathering of curious onlookers standing outside the house. Such crowds often gathered wherever an unsolved crime had occurred. A tall man wearing tinted spectacles appeared to be explaining his own theory of the murder with great confidence. Several listeners followed his words with eager attention, though the explanation struck me as imaginative rather than convincing. Having heard enough, I quietly stepped away from the crowd. As I turned, I accidentally collided with an elderly gentleman whose arms were filled with old books. Several volumes slipped from his grasp and scattered across the pavement. I immediately bent to retrieve them, apologizing for my clumsiness. One title caught my attention before I returned it. It concerned ancient tree worship, a subject unusual enough to suggest its owner possessed rather uncommon interests. The elderly man accepted the books with visible irritation. His back was bent with age, white whiskers framed his narrow face, and his manner suggested that the volumes were among his greatest treasures. Without offering more than a brief acknowledgment, he disappeared into the gathering mist, leaving me with the curious impression that there was something oddly memorable about him. At the time, however, I believed our meeting to be nothing more than one of those small encounters that so often occur upon London's crowded streets. I could not have imagined that the quiet old bookseller had already stepped into one of the most astonishing chapters of my entire life. If you enjoy these quiet recollections of our adventures, you are always welcome to join me again for another Sherlock Holmes case. I remained outside number 427 Park Lane for several quiet moments after the elderly book collector disappeared into the evening crowd. The house itself revealed nothing that had escaped the careful attention of the police. Its elegant brick walls stood peacefully beneath the fading light, while the open space before it seemed far too exposed for anyone to have approached unseen. I studied the upper window, where Ronald Adair had spent his final moments. From the street below, it appeared almost impossible that anyone could have reached it without leaving some trace. A low iron railing enclosed the small garden, and beyond it lay a narrow bed of spring flowers. The blossoms remained perfectly undisturbed, just as every newspaper had reported. There were no drain pipes near enough to assist a climber, no projecting stonework upon which a man might gain a foothold, and no marks upon the soft ground below. The longer I observed the house, the more impossible the crime appeared. If the murderer had entered through the door, how had he escaped from a room locked from within? If he had fired from outside, why had no one heard the shot? If robbery had been the purpose, why had every coin and banknote remained neatly arranged upon the table? These questions circled quietly within my thoughts as I began the walk back towards Kensington. Throughout my years beside Sherlock Holmes, I had witnessed many remarkable investigations. More than once, I had believed a mystery entirely beyond explanation, only to discover that Holmes had noticed some tiny detail invisible to everyone else. Those memories accompanied me now, though tinged with sadness, for I believed I would never again benefit from his extraordinary observations. I found myself unconsciously asking what Holmes might have done. He would not have hurried. He would have observed patiently. He would have separated fact from assumption. Most importantly, he would have distrusted every conclusion that seemed too obvious. I attempted to imitate that careful habit of thought, yet I lacked the remarkable gift that allowed Holmes to transform scattered details into certainty. The pieces lay before me, but they refused to fit together. By the time I reached my home, evening shadows had settled comfortably over London. A cheerful fire burned within my study, its gentle warmth easing the chill that had gathered during my walk. Books lined the familiar shelves, and my medical notes lay waiting upon the desk where I had left them earlier that morning. It was a peaceful room, one well suited for quiet reflection after the day's work. I had scarcely been seated for 5 minutes when my maid entered. She informed me that a visitor wished to see me. Expecting perhaps a patient or neighbor, I asked that the gentleman be shown inside. To my complete surprise, the visitor proved to be none other than the elderly book collector whom I had accidentally met outside Park Lane. He entered slowly beneath the weight of another large collection of worn volumes cradled carefully beneath one arm. His bent shoulders, white whiskers, and awkward gait appeared exactly as I remembered them from only a short while earlier. His expression, however, had softened considerably. He apologized for his earlier manner. With a humility that seemed sincere, he explained that after our accidental collision, he had learned whose house I had entered. Feeling that he had behaved rather rudely toward a gentleman who had shown him kindness, he had decided to call personally and offer his thanks. The explanation appeared perfectly reasonable. Indeed, there was something almost touching about the old man's concern for good manners. He introduced himself as the owner of a small bookshop nearby and spoke warmly of rare editions, forgotten histories, and curious volumes that might interest a collector. His thin, croaking voice carried the peculiar enthusiasm of a man who had spent much of his life among dusty shelves and fading paper. One by one, he displayed several books with obvious pride. Some concerned ancient religions, others explored natural history, a few contained classical literature. Though I admired old books, I possessed neither the time nor the knowledge required to become a serious collector. Nevertheless, I listened politely while he described their merits. As he glanced around my study, his attention settled upon one particular bookshelf behind me. "There," he remarked pleasantly, "is a gap that could easily be filled by a few suitable volumes." Instinctively, I turned my head to look. It was only the briefest movement, no more than a second. Yet when I looked back to where my visitor, everything had changed. The elderly bookseller had vanished. Standing calmly, where he had been only a heartbeat before, was Sherlock Holmes. For several endless moments, I simply stared. My mind refused to accept what my eyes plainly witnessed. The tall, spare figure, the keen gray eyes, the sharp features that no disguise could truly conceal. Every line of the face belonged to the friend whose death I had mourned for 3 long years. The room itself seemed suddenly unreal. The crackling fire, the familiar shelves, the evening light beyond the window, all remained exactly as before, and yet nothing was the same. A rushing sound filled my ears. The walls appeared to sway gently around me. The overwhelming shock proved greater than I could bear. I have faced dangerous illnesses. I have served upon battlefields. I have witnessed scenes of tragedy that few men are fortunate enough to avoid. Yet never before or since have I experienced such complete astonishment. Darkness briefly overcame me. When awareness slowly returned, I found myself seated in my chair with my collar loosened. The unmistakable taste of brandy lingered upon my lips. Holmes leaned over me with genuine concern. The familiar expression upon his face was enough to convince me that I was fully awake. No dream could reproduce him so perfectly. His hand rested lightly upon my shoulder, and although his features carried the marks of recent hardship, there remained the same quiet confidence that had so often reassured me during our adventures. His first concern was not for himself, but for my recovery. He apologized for the dramatic nature of his appearance, confessing that he had underestimated the effect such a meeting might have upon me. Even then, despite everything that had happened, his voice remained wonderfully calm. I reached forward almost without thinking and grasped his arm. It was warm, solid, undeniably real. No phantom stood before me. No ghost returned from memory. Sherlock Holmes was alive. The joy that filled my heart at that moment cannot easily be described. Grief, relief, disbelief, gratitude, and astonishment blended together until words themselves became inadequate. For many months I had carried the weight of losing my closest companion. Now, in a single impossible instant, that burden vanished. I found myself studying every detail of his appearance, fearful that if I looked away, he might disappear again. He appeared thinner than before. His face bore a paler complexion than I remembered, suggesting years spent under strain and constant danger. Yet his eyes remained wonderfully bright. Their sharp intelligence had lost none of its remarkable power. Even his quiet smile was unmistakable. It was the smile of a man who had already solved several problems before anyone else had realized they existed. The disguise lay discarded upon my study table. The white wig, the bent shoulders, the false whiskers, the old coat. Beside them rested the stack of books that had completed the remarkable illusion. Only then did I begin to appreciate the extraordinary skill with which Holmes had transformed himself. I recalled every movement outside Park Lane, the awkward walk, the irritated manner, the careful protection of the books, even his unusual voice. Each detail had been performed so perfectly that I had never entertained the slightest suspicion. Holmes had deceived not merely strangers in the street, he had deceived me. Had anyone asked me only moments earlier whether the elderly bookseller and Sherlock Holmes could possibly be the same person, I should have dismissed the idea as absurd. Such was the perfection of his disguise. At last I found sufficient composure to sit opposite him. Questions crowded my thoughts faster than I could ask them. How had he survived the Reichenbach Falls? Where had he been during those missing years? Why had he allowed the entire world to believe him dead? Why reveal himself now? Holmes listened patiently while I struggled to collect my thoughts. At length, he explained that every answer would indeed be given, but not immediately. A matter of the greatest importance still demanded his attention that very night. He required my assistance once more. There was danger ahead. The work could not wait until morning. When it had been completed, he promised nothing would remain concealed between us. His request stirred feelings I had not experienced for years. Without hesitation, I agreed. There had never been a time when I refused Holmes my company in an investigation, and I could hardly begin now, after believing him lost forever. It felt strangely comforting to hear him calmly discussing practical matters once again, as though the past 3 years had been only a brief interruption in our friendship. The fire continued burning quietly behind us. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of carriage wheels along the wet streets. London itself seemed unaware that one of its greatest mysteries had just quietly ended within walls of my little study. Yet another, even greater mystery had only just begun. At that moment I still knew almost nothing. I did not know how Holmes had escaped certain death. I did not know why he had remained hidden from every friend who loved him. Most of all, I did not yet understand that his return was closely connected to the impossible murder of Ronald Adair. The strangest part of the mystery was still ahead. For some time I could do little more than look at Sherlock Holmes. The fire burned steadily between us, casting its warm glow across the familiar study. Outside, the evening wind brushed softly against the windows, and the distant sounds of London drifted through the quiet streets. It was a peaceful setting, yet my thoughts were anything but calm. Only a short while earlier I had believed myself entirely alone. Now the friend whose death I had mourned for 3 long years sat opposite me, as though he had merely returned from a brief journey. I found myself studying every feature of his face. Though unmistakably Holmes, he had changed in subtle ways. His frame seemed even leaner than before, and the pale color of his face suggested years spent under constant strain. There were faint lines that hardship had written round his eyes, yet those keen gray eyes retained all their remarkable brightness. No amount of danger had diminished the extraordinary sharpness of his mind. Holmes rested comfortably in his chair, apparently quite at ease after revealing himself. The disguise of the elderly bookseller and now lay scattered upon my table. The white wig, the curved padding that had altered his posture, the false whiskers, the worn coat, and the stack of old books all testified to the perfection of his craft. He noticed my glance and smiled faintly. The disguise served its purpose remarkably well, he observed, in his calm manner. It certainly had. I admitted that I had not entertained the slightest suspicion when we had crossed paths outside Park Lane. Holmes accepted the compliment with quiet satisfaction, though never with vanity. For him, disguises were simply another practical instrument, no different from a magnifying lens or a chemical reagent. My curiosity, however, could no longer be restrained. Every question returned at once. How had he escaped from the Reichenbach Falls? Where had he disappeared? Why had he remained silent for so many years? Holmes regarded me thoughtfully before answering. He explained that the full account would require some patience, for the night's work still lay ahead of us. Nevertheless, he understood my anxiety and agreed to reveal at least the events that had occurred beside the famous waterfall. I settled back into my chair, scarcely daring to interrupt him. His voice remained calm and measured, as though he were describing an ordinary afternoon, rather than one of the greatest adventures of his life. He reminded me of the final letter I had found beside the Reichenbach Falls. Every word, he assured me, had been genuine. At that dreadful moment, he had fully expected to die. Professor Moriarty had followed him onto the narrow mountain path overlooking the roaring waters below. Holmes immediately recognized the determination within his enemy's face. The professor had abandoned every hope of escape and sought only one final act of revenge. Realizing there could be no peaceful conclusion, Holmes had requested a few moments in which to write a farewell message. Moriarty, displaying the strange courtesy that sometimes exists even between determined enemies, allowed him to do so. Holmes left the note where I would surely discover it. He also placed beside it his cigarette case and walking stick. Those familiar objects had convinced me that no hope remained. When Holmes finished writing, he continued toward the narrow end of the path. No witnesses spotted. Moriarty followed. There were no witnesses. Only two men stood above the tremendous roar of the waterfall. Holmes explained that Moriarty carried no firearm. Instead, the professor relied entirely upon physical strength. Without warning, he rushed forward and seized Holmes in a desperate embrace, intending to drag them both over the edge into the abyss below. The struggle lasted only moments. Fortunately, Holmes possessed knowledge of a Japanese system of self-defense known as baritsu, an art that relied more upon balance and movement than brute strength. As Moriarty tightened his grip, Holmes twisted free with one swift movement. The professor, unable to recover his balance, stumbled toward the edge. For a few terrible seconds he fought desperately against the inevitable. Then he vanished. Holmes watched him fall until the dark figure struck the rocks below before disappearing into the torrent. As Holmes quietly recounted these events, I found myself once again standing in memory beside that dreadful chasm. I remembered the farewell letter. I remembered the lonely mountain path. I remembered believing that both men had fallen together. How easily appearances had deceived us all. I interrupted only long enough to ask the question that had troubled me since the day of his supposed death. "If you survived," I asked gently, "how could there have been only one set of returning footprints?" Holmes nodded slightly, as though he had expected the question. He explained that the answer had occurred to him almost immediately after Moriarty's fall. The professor had not been the only dangerous man seeking his life. Several loyal followers of the criminal organization still remained at large. If they believed Holmes alive, they would continue hunting him without rest. If they believed him dead, they would eventually relax their guard. That simple realization changed everything. The apparent tragedy offered an extraordinary opportunity. Rather than correct the misunderstanding, Holmes chose to preserve it. He decided that the world must continue believing he had died beside the waterfall. Only then could he move freely enough to destroy the remnants of Moriarty's organization. The plan carried immense risk. It also demanded painful sacrifices. Holmes admitted that allowing his close friends to mourn him had been one of the hardest decisions of his life. Yet, he believed no safer alternative existed. The cliff behind the narrow path, he continued, appeared almost vertical when viewed from below. In truth, however, small ledges and tiny footholds offered just enough support for a careful climber. The ascent required exceptional courage. One mistake would have sent him plunging into the same depths as Moriarty. Slowly, patiently, Holmes climbed upward until he reached a narrow shelf covered with soft moss. Hidden there, among the rocks, he remained completely invisible. From that concealed position he watched as I, together with the local authorities, examined every trace left upon the path. He confessed, with a smile that carried more affection than amusement, that our investigation had been energetic but entirely mistaken. Listening to him, I experienced an odd mixture of relief and embarrassment. For years I had accepted every appearance without question. Meanwhile, Holmes had been quietly watching us from only a short distance away. Yet the greatest danger had not ended with Moriarty's death. Indeed, it had only begun. While Holmes rested upon the rocky ledge, an enormous stone suddenly crashed past him into the abyss below. At first, he assumed it had broken loose naturally. Almost immediately, another followed. The second stone struck close enough to convince him that the attack was deliberate. Looking upward, he briefly saw the outline of another man standing high above the cliff. Someone else had witnessed the struggle. Someone else knew Holmes remained alive. That unseen figure had accompanied Moriarty to Switzerland and now intended to complete the work his leader had failed to accomplish. Another great stone came hurtling downward. Holmes realized he could not remain where he was. Although climbing down proved even more dangerous than climbing up, necessity left him no choice. He descended as rapidly as circumstances allowed, often slipping upon the wet rock and trusting entirely to instinct and determination. Another stone narrowly missed him before he finally reached the narrow path once more. Without pausing, he escaped through the mountains under cover of darkness. He traveled many miles before allowing himself even a brief rest. Only after reaching safety did he fully understand what his escape demanded. From that moment onward, Sherlock Holmes ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. His enemies believed him dead. His friends believed him dead. Even I believed him dead. The deception had become complete. As Holmes fell silent for a few moments, neither of us spoke. The flames within the fireplace shifted gently, sending new patterns of light across the room. I reflected upon everything I had endured after receiving news of his death. How often I had wished for one final conversation. How many evenings I have remembered our adventures together. Holmes seemed to understand those thoughts without my expressing them. His expression grew more thoughtful. He admitted quietly that he had often wished to write to me. More than once he had begun such a letter. Each time he destroyed it before it could be sent. He feared that even the smallest mistake might reveal his survival to enemies who remained both patient and merciless. The fewer people who knew the truth, the greater his chance of completing the dangerous work before him. Was a cruel necessity. Yet, he believed it had saved not only his own life, but possibly mine as well. Looking back upon those years, I could no longer feel resentment, only gratitude remained. Holmes had carried his loneliness in silence so that others might remain safe. Little did I know that his remarkable story had only reached its beginning. The years he had spent wandering far from England still remained untold, and before the night was over, I would learn where the world's greatest consulting detective had vanished after leaving the Reichenbach Falls. Holmes paused for a few moments after describing his escape from the Reichenbach Falls. The fire crackled softly beside us, and neither of us felt any need to hurry the conversation. The years that had separated us could not be explained in a few hurried sentences. Each answer seemed to reveal another hidden chapter, and I listened with complete attention, determined not to lose a single detail. At last, Holmes continued. Once he had escaped from the mountains, he knew there could be no return to England. The man who had attempted to crush him beneath falling rocks remained alive. More importantly, that man knew Sherlock Holmes had survived. As long as such enemies remained at liberty, London was no safe place for him. His first duty, therefore, was not to seek comfort among friends, but to disappear so completely that even the keenest observer would believe him gone forever. Only one person shared his secret, his brother, Mycroft. Holmes explained that someone had to know the truth, if only to provide financial assistance when necessary. Mycroft possessed both the discretion and intelligence required for such confidence. No one else could safely be trusted. As for me, Holmes admitted that concealing the truth had caused him genuine sorrow. Several times during those lonely years, he had been tempted to write. He imagined my surprise upon receiving such a letter. He imagined my relief. Yet each time reason overcame emotion. If I alone had known the truth, my face might unknowingly have betrayed it. A careless word, an unexpected expression, or even a chance meeting with one of Moriarty's associates could have destroyed years of careful planning. Holmes had never doubted my loyalty. He doubted only the impossible burden of carrying such a dangerous secret. I understood. Painful though it had been, I could not deny the wisdom of his decision. Holmes leaned back comfortably and allowed his thoughts to wander across the years. His journey, he explained, carried him first to Florence, where he remained only long enough to satisfy himself that no one had followed his escape from Switzerland. From there, his travels gradually extended farther than either of us could ever have imagined. During our days at Baker Street, the world became his refuge. Under assumed identities and carefully chosen disguises, he crossed countries without attracting notice. He spoke of the high mountain roads that stretched beyond Europe, where ancient monasteries overlooked valleys untouched by modern industry. There he observed distant cultures with the same patient curiosity he once devoted to London's criminals. Eventually, his travels brought him to Tibet. The journey itself required immense endurance, yet Holmes described it with remarkable simplicity. He never glorified hardship, nor did he exaggerate danger. Instead, he recalled long roads, quiet monasteries, clear mountain air, and conversations with scholars whose knowledge had been gathered across centuries. For a time, he visited Lhasa. There he spent several peaceful days among learned men whose calm habits appealed greatly to his own disciplined nature. Holmes confessed that although his reputation rested upon solving crimes, he had always found equal pleasure in studying the countless varieties of human knowledge. He smiled faintly as he remembered those distant months. There are mysteries beyond crime, he observed quietly, and some of them are equally rewarding. From Tibet, his travels carried him westward through Persia. He described endless deserts where evening arrived with astonishing beauty, the fading sunlight transforming the landscape into gentle shades of gold and violet. Ancient cities rose beside caravan routes that had existed long before the Roman Empire, reminding him how brief even the greatest human lives appeared against the vast history of civilization. He spoke not as a tourist seeking excitement, but as a careful observer who delighted in understanding the world exactly as he found it. Wherever he traveled, he watched. Wherever he watched, he learned. His journey eventually led him to the holy city of Mecca. Holmes spoke only briefly of that visit, respecting both its religious importance and the privacy of those he encountered there. It formed another quiet chapter within his years of wandering, one more place where anonymity served as his greatest protection. Later he continued into the Sudan, where he met the Khalifa. Holmes explained that certain observations, gathered during that visit, later proved useful enough to be communicated privately to officials within the British Foreign Office. He mentioned this matter only in passing, showing little interest in discussing any political significance attached to it. His attention always returned to observation itself. Facts interested him more than fame. After leaving the East, Holmes traveled into France. There, he entered an entirely different world. For several months, he worked quietly in a scientific laboratory at Montpellier, devoting himself to research involving coal tar derivatives. The subject sounded remarkably familiar. Many evenings in Baker Street had found Holmes surrounded by chemical apparatus, bottles, and curious experiments whose purpose only he fully understood. It pleased me greatly to imagine that even while hidden from the world, he had continued pursuing scientific knowledge with the same enthusiasm. Crime had never been his only passion. Science remained an equal companion throughout his life. The laboratory offered him something rare: peace. For a brief period, no criminals pursued him. No desperate clients interrupted his work. He could devote long hours entirely to careful research. Holmes admitted that he found those months unexpectedly satisfying. Yet even while engaged in chemistry, he never abandoned his greater purpose. Newspapers from London reached him regularly. Every report concerning crime, every arrest, every trial connected with Moriarty's former organization received his closest attention. He watched patiently. One by one, the old criminal network slowly weakened. Some members disappeared, others were arrested, still others abandoned their former activities. Yet one dangerous enemy remained at large. The very man who had attempted to kill Holmes upon the cliffs above the Reichenbach Falls still walked freely through London. Holmes never spoke the man's name, not yet. Instead, he described him only as the most dangerous surviving member of Moriarty's organization, a man of extraordinary patience, a superb marksman, an individual who never forgot an enemy. As long as that man remained free, Holmes considered England unsafe. Therefore he continued waiting. Months became years. He remained patient because patience itself formed one of his greatest strengths. Many detectives, Holmes remarked, ruined their own investigations by acting too soon. A hunter who frightened his prey before the proper moment often returned home empty-handed. Holmes preferred certainty over haste. At last the situation changed. While reading newspapers from London, one particular report immediately caught his attention: the impossible murder of Ronald Adair. The details stirred his curiosity at once. Here was a young gentleman shot inside a locked room. No weapon, no visible murderer, no clear motive. Most readers saw only an unsolved crime. Holmes saw something very different. He recognized methods, patterns, possibilities invisible to others. Certain details suggested not merely an unusual murder, but the work of someone whose abilities Holmes already knew remarkably well. The case itself would have interested him under any circumstances, yet another thought struck him almost immediately. If his suspicions proved correct, Ronald Adair's death might finally provide the opportunity he had awaited for 3 long years. The last great enemy could perhaps be drawn into the open. The hunter might finally become the hunted. Holmes therefore abandoned his scientific work without delay. He returned quietly to England under yet another disguise. arrival in London remained unnoticed by almost everyone. Only Mycroft knew he had come home. Holmes smiled gently as he recalled his first visit back to Baker Street. Miss Hudson answered the door exactly as she always had. When she recognized the familiar face standing before her, the shock proved almost too much for the faithful housekeeper. Holmes assured me that her delight far exceeded her surprise. Though both emotions appeared in generous measure, she had believed him dead. Now, like myself, only hours earlier, she found the impossible standing before her. Mycroft had faithfully preserved every room exactly as Holmes had left it years before. The familiar furniture remained. The chemical equipment still occupied its accustomed place. The violin rested safely where countless evenings had ended in quiet music. Even Holmes's papers awaited his return. Nothing essential had changed. Only the passing years separated the old Baker Street from the new. Holmes confessed that sitting once more in his well-worn armchair had stirred emotions he rarely displayed. Holmes possesses a peculiar power over every traveler. No matter how far one journeys, familiar surroundings awaken memories, unlike any others. Yet sentiment could occupy only a few brief moments. Work awaited him. The Park Lane mystery demanded immediate attention. More importantly, he believed the unknown murderer would soon come searching for Sherlock Holmes himself. His enemies had watched Baker Street before. Surely they would watch it again. This expectation formed the foundation of a plan so daring that I could scarcely imagine its success. Holmes glanced toward the clock upon my mantel. The hour had advanced steadily while he spoke. Outside, darkness had fully settled across London. He rose quietly to his feet. "My dear Watson," he said with calm determination, "our conversation must pause for the present. Before dawn you shall know everything. But first there is a piece of unfinished business waiting for us." I stood immediately. The familiar excitement of our former adventures returned almost at once. 3 years had vanished, as though they had never existed. I was once again preparing to accompany Sherlock Holmes into the quiet streets of London. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Holmes stood and reached for the worn traveling coat that still hung where it had rested years before. Watching him move about the familiar room filled me with a quiet sense of comfort. It seemed impossible that so much time had passed. Every movement, every careful habit, reminded me of the countless evenings when another curious case had called us away from the warmth of Baker Street. The fire behind us burned low, its gentle glow dancing across the old furniture. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, London waited, beneath a sky hidden by drifting clouds. The streets would soon belong to policemen upon their rounds, the occasional late traveler, and those shadowy figures who preferred darkness to daylight. Holmes adjusted his collar and glanced toward the clock. "We have sufficient time for a simple meal," he remarked. "The work before us will demand patience rather than haste." His calm confidence reassured me more than any lengthy explanation could have done. Although I still knew very little of his plan, I trusted his judgment completely. That confidence had been earned through years of shared adventures, and not even 3 years of absence had diminished it. We ate quietly, speaking only now and then. Holmes showed little interest in food, as is often his habit when deeply occupied by a difficult investigation. His thoughts clearly remained fixed upon the work awaiting us later that evening. From time to time he would fall silent, his eyes resting thoughtfully upon the fire. I recognized that expression well. His remarkable mind was arranging facts invisible to everyone else. Rather than interrupt, I allowed him the peace he required. The hours passed gently. Outside, the evening deepened. At last, Holmes rose once more. "The time has come." There was no excitement in his voice, only calm certainty. I retrieved my coat and hat. Almost by instinct, I also placed my revolver into my pocket. Holmes noticed the movement with quiet approval. Old habits, it seemed, returned very naturally. Soon afterward, we stepped into the cool London night. The city possessed a peaceful beauty at that late hour. Gas lamps cast warm circles of light upon damp pavements. A faint mist drifted slowly between the buildings, softening the outlines of distant streets. The steady rhythm of carriage wheels echoed now and then before fading into silence again. Though London remained one of the busiest cities in the world, there were moments such as this when it seemed almost tranquil. Our cab carried us steadily through streets I had traveled countless times before. For several minutes Holmes remained completely silent. His gaze wandered thoughtfully beyond the window. The passing lights briefly illuminated his face before disappearing again into shadow. I noticed that his expression had become unusually serious. The warmth that had accompanied our reunion in my study had quietly given way to complete professional concentration. Whatever awaited us that night, Holmes regarded it with the utmost respect. I considered asking where we were going. Before I could speak, however, the cab slowed unexpectedly. We had not reached Baker Street. Instead, Holmes instructed the driver to stop near Cavendish Square. This surprised me greatly. Once upon the pavement, Holmes immediately looked carefully in every direction. He examined each crossing, every side street, and every passing figure with such deliberate attention that I instantly understood the importance of remaining unseen. Only after satisfying himself that no one appeared to be following us did he begin walking. I followed without question. Our route soon became wonderfully confusing. Holmes led me away from the broader streets into a network of narrow lanes and quiet mews that I scarcely knew existed. We passed behind long rows of respectable houses where stables stood hidden from the fashionable streets beyond. The scent of horses lingered faintly in the cool air. Occasionally, a stable lantern glowed softly behind half-open doors. Elsewhere, everything remained silent. Holmes never hesitated. He turned one corner after another with complete confidence, as though every hidden passage had been committed perfectly to memory. His knowledge of London's lesser-known streets had always astonished me. Tonight that remarkable familiarity proved invaluable. More than once he paused briefly before crossing an open street, carefully observing both directions before continuing. His caution impressed itself upon me. This was no ordinary investigation. Someone dangerous was expected, someone whom Holmes considered fully capable of recognizing even the smallest mistake. The farther we walked, the quieter the city became. The sounds of busy traffic faded behind us. Only the wind accompanied our footsteps now, whispering gently through narrow alleys and around the corners of old buildings. Eventually, Holmes turned into a small street lined with rather gloomy houses, whose better days had long since passed. Their windows were dark. Many appeared unoccupied. Some showed signs of neglect. The peaceful silence surrounding them gave the neighborhood an oddly forgotten appearance. Without explanation, Holmes entered a narrow passage beside one of the buildings. A weathered wooden gate stood partly hidden within the shadows. He produced a key. The gate opened without difficulty. Beyond it lay a deserted yard, enclosed by high brick walls. Not a single light shone there. The place felt entirely abandoned. Crossing the yard, Holmes approached the rear entrance of one particular house. Again, used a key. The old lock yielded quietly. He motioned for me to follow. Once inside, he carefully secured the door behind us. Darkness surrounded us completely. For several moments, I could distinguish almost nothing. The house possessed the unmistakable stillness of a place long left empty. Dust scented the cool air. Footsteps echoed softly across bare wooden floors. Somewhere within the building, loose boards creaked beneath our weight. Holmes gently touched my arm. Without speaking, he guided me forward through the darkness. His movements remained slow and certain. Clearly, he had already explored this building. Trusting him completely, I allowed him to lead the way. We crossed a long entrance hall, where faded wallpaper hung loosely from the walls. Time and neglect had claimed every trace of comfort the house once possessed. There were no carpets, no furniture, only empty rooms waiting quietly beneath years of silence. At length, a faint gray glow appeared ahead. It filtered through a dusty window somewhere within the house. Holmes turned sharply into a larger room and finally stopped. My eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness. The room itself stood almost entirely empty. Only the pale light from the street beyond provided enough illumination to reveal its broad shape. Dust covered every surface. The air remained perfectly still. Holmes stepped close beside me. Speaking scarcely above a whisper, he asked a simple question. "Do you know where we are?" His voice carried a curious note, as though he expected my answer to surprise me. I approached the window carefully. The glass itself appeared thick with dust accumulated over many months. Taking care not to expose myself, I peered cautiously through a small, clear space. The familiar street immediately caught my attention. Across the road stood a building I knew better than almost any other in London. Its windows, its doorway, its unmistakable brick frontage. There could be no mistake. It was Baker Street. More precisely, it was the very house that had once been our home. For a brief moment, memory overcame reason. How many evenings had I climbed those stairs beside Holmes? How many remarkable clients crossed that familiar threshold? How many mysteries had begun within those comfortable rooms? Now I observed them from the opposite side of the street. Holmes quietly confirmed my realization. We stood inside an empty house directly opposite our former lodgings. Only then did I begin to understand why he had chosen such an unusual destination. This abandoned building offered a perfect view of Baker Street. Whatever Holmes expected to happen would unfold before our eyes. Still, one question remained. "Why are we here?" I asked softly. Holmes smiled, almost imperceptibly. "Because," he replied, "this house allows us to watch without ourselves being observed." His answer, though brief, awakened my curiosity more than ever. Carefully he instructed me to move closer to the dusty window, while ensuring that neither my face nor my silhouette became visible from outside. I followed his directions exactly. Then I looked toward the familiar sitting room, where so many adventures had begun. The curtains were drawn. A bright lamp illuminated the room from within. Against the blind appeared the unmistakable dark outline of a seated man. The profile, the sharp features, the lean shoulders, the familiar shape of the head. Every detail belonged to Sherlock Holmes. I stared in complete amazement. My companion stood quietly beside me. Yet another Holmes appeared plainly visible across the street. For one astonishing instant, my thoughts refused to accept what my eyes reported. Instinctively, I reached out and touched Holmes' sleeve, merely to reassure myself that he truly remained beside me. He gave a faint laugh. The sound carried genuine satisfaction. He had anticipated my reaction perfectly. "It is astonishing, is it not?" he whispered. certainly was. From where we stood, the figure across the street appeared absolutely convincing. Had I been walking along Baker Street below, I should have sworn under oath that Sherlock Holmes sat peacefully within his old sitting room. Every outline appeared perfect, every proportion exactly right. Even knowing Holmes stood beside me, I found it difficult to believe that the figure opposite could possibly be anything other than the man himself. Little did I know that this silent figure would soon become the center of Holmes' boldest trap yet. For several long moments, I could not take my eyes from the familiar silhouette across Baker Street. The figure sat exactly where I had so often seen Sherlock Holmes, resting after a difficult investigation. The sharp outline of the head, the straight back, and the distinctive shape of the shoulders were reproduced with astonishing accuracy. Had I been standing upon the pavement below, I should have greeted the occupant without the slightest hesitation. Holmes seemed quietly pleased by my reaction. He never sought praise for its own sake, yet he appreciated careful craftsmanship, whether it belonged to a violin maker, a chemist, or an artist. In this case, he explained, the remarkable likeness was not his own work alone. The wax figure had been sculpted by a skilled French artist named Monsieur Oscar Minier, whose talent for creating lifelike forms had proved invaluable. Holmes had commissioned the work long before returning openly to London, anticipating that one day such a deception might become useful. The sculptor had captured every familiar feature with extraordinary precision. Holmes himself had merely completed the final arrangement. He dressed the figure in one of his old dressing gowns, carefully positioned it in the sitting room, and placed a bright lamp behind it so that only the unmistakable outline appeared through the blind. The effect, as I had already discovered, was almost impossible to distinguish from reality. "It truly is remarkable," I admitted quietly. Holmes inclined his head with a modest smile. "I required certain people to believe I was comfortably at home," he said. "In reality, I intended to be somewhere entirely different." His meaning slowly became clearer. The wax figure was never intended to deceive the public. It had been prepared for one very particular audience. I asked whether he believed someone was watching Baker Street. Holmes answered without the slightest hesitation. He did not merely suspect it, he knew it. That certainty immediately caught my attention. His confidence rested not upon guesswork, but upon direct observation. Earlier that very day, shortly after returning to his old rooms, he had glanced casually through the window and recognized a familiar face among those lingering outside. The watcher was an insignificant criminal named Parker, a man previously known to the police for violent robberies and street attacks. Alone, Parker presented little concern. Holmes described him almost dismissively. He served merely as a lookout. The true danger lay elsewhere. Someone far more capable directed the surveillance. The same unseen enemy who had followed Holmes to Switzerland. The same man who had stood high above the Reichenbach Falls and hurled great stones toward the narrow ledge where Holmes struggled for his life. That man, Holmes explained quietly, had remained patient for 3 years. He believed Holmes dead. Yet the moment word spread that Sherlock Holmes had returned to Baker Street, the old hunt would begin again. Holmes expected exactly that response. He welcomed it. Indeed, his entire plan depended upon it. As he spoke, I began to appreciate the elegance of his design. The enemy believed Holmes sat peacefully inside his old rooms. In reality, Holmes observed the watcher from a hidden position across the street. The hunter believed himself unseen. Instead, he had unknowingly become the object of observation. The trap had already begun. You remained standing beside the dusty window, saying little. Silence seemed entirely appropriate. Outside, London continued its ordinary evening life, unaware that a deadly contest of patience was quietly unfolding between two extraordinary minds. The wind carried scraps of conversation along the pavement before they quickly faded into the night. Occasional carriages passed beneath the gas lamps. Gentlemen hurried home with collars turned against the cool breeze. Servants crossed the street on late errands. Nothing in their ordinary movements suggested that they were passing between hunter and hunted. Holmes scarcely moved. His entire attention rested upon Baker Street. Years of practice had taught him how to remain perfectly still for astonishing lengths of time, whenever circumstances required. Only his eyes betrayed the intensity of his concentration. They moved steadily across every doorway, every passing figure, every shadow cast beneath the lamps. I followed his gaze as carefully as I could. Gradually, I noticed two men standing some distance farther along the street. They remained sheltered within the entrance of a darkened building, apparently seeking protection from the evening wind. Something about their behavior attracted my attention. Unlike ordinary pedestrians, it did not continue walking. They lingered. Occasionally, one glanced toward Baker Street before returning to the shelter of the doorway. Their conduct appeared unusual enough that I quietly mentioned them to Holmes. He listened, but gave only the slightest shake of his head. His attention remained fixed elsewhere. Whatever he awaited had not yet appeared. The minutes passed slowly. Time itself seemed to lose its ordinary pace. Within the empty house, every sound became strangely distinct. The old timbers settled with faint creaks. The wind sighed gently beneath loose roof tiles. Somewhere a shutter tapped softly against weathered brick. Otherwise, there was only silence. Standing beside Holmes once again, after so many years, awakened countless memories. I recalled long nights spent observing houses where criminals hid. I remembered patient hours waiting in darkness while Holmes quietly assembled facts invisible to everyone else. Many of his greatest successes had depended not upon sudden action, but upon the willingness to wait. Tonight proved no different. The mystery demanded patience before courage. Holmes remained perfectly composed, yet after some time I began noticing subtle signs of growing uneasiness. He shifted his weight slightly. Once or twice he tapped his fingers lightly against the wall. He paced quietly across the room before returning once more to the window. To anyone unfamiliar with him, these movements would have appeared insignificant. To me, they revealed much. Something had not unfolded precisely as he expected. Holmes rarely became impatient. When he did, it usually meant that events were taking an unforeseen course. Outside, the street gradually emptied. The hour approached midnight. The number of passing pedestrians steadily diminished until long stretches of quiet separated one traveler from the next. The two men beneath the distant doorway became increasingly difficult to distinguish within the darkness. The gas lamps flickered softly as the wind strengthened. Baker Street itself seemed to settle into peaceful sleep. The wax figure remained motionless behind the blind. Its stillness made the illusion all the more convincing. From our hidden position, it continued to resemble Holmes, seated comfortably within his familiar armchair. Then, quite unexpectedly, I noticed something that caused me to catch my breath. The silhouette had changed. A moment earlier, the figure had been shown in profile. Now it faced another direction. Its back appeared toward the window. The movement was unmistakable. Instinctively, I grasped Holmes's sleeve. "Figure has moved," I whispered. Holmes gave a faint smile. He seemed almost amused by my surprise. "Naturally," he answered softly. Only then did he explain another remarkable part of his arrangement. Mrs. Hudson herself remained inside Baker Street. Every 15 minutes, she carefully altered the position of the wax figure. She performed the task from the front of the room so that her own shadow never appear upon the blind. Small changes prevented attentive observers from suspecting they watched an unmoving object. To anyone outside, Sherlock Holmes simply appeared to shift comfortably in his chair from time to time. The illusion grew stronger with every passing hour. I found myself silently admiring Miss Hudson's courage. She understood perfectly well that danger's eyes watched the house, yet she carried out her task faithfully, trusting Holmes completely. Few people who knew only the gentle housekeeper could have guessed the quiet bravery she possessed. Holmes resumed his silent watch. The street remained empty. The wax figure sat motionless once more. The wind whistled gently along the rows of houses. Then, without warning, everything about Holmes changed. I heard a quick intake of breath. His entire body became rigid. Every trace of impatience vanished instantly. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed upon something I could not yet see. His hand closed firmly around my arm. Without speaking, he guided me backward into the deepest shadow of the room. There, he pressed one finger gently against his lips. The warning required no explanation. Someone was near. At first I heard nothing beyond the ordinary sounds of the sleeping city. Then, very faintly, another sound reached my ears. It did not come from Baker Street. It came from somewhere inside the very house where we stood concealed. A door opened softly. Moments later, it closed again. Silence returned. Then came another sound. Footsteps. Very careful footsteps. Someone was moving slowly along the dark passage behind us. The intruder clearly believed the house to be empty. Each step was cautious, deliberate, almost silent. Yet within those deserted rooms, every movement echoed gently through the darkness. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Without a word, I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around the grip of my revolver. Beside me, Holmes remained absolutely motionless. His calmness steadied my own nerves. The footsteps drew nearer, closer, closer still. A dark shape slowly appeared within the doorway leading into our room. Against the deeper darkness behind him, the figure became just visible. For one long moment he stood perfectly still, listening. Then, crouching low, he began moving silently toward the open window overlooking Baker Street. He passed within only a few feet of where Holmes and I remained hidden, completely unaware that we watched his every movement. The strangest part of the mystery was still ahead. Holmes and I remained perfectly still within the deepest shadows of the deserted room. The intruder had entered so quietly that had we not already been watching and listening with the greatest care, we might never have known he was there at all. Every movement suggested long experience. He paused after each cautious step, listening before advancing again, as though he expected danger to appear from the darkness itself. Fortunately for us, he believed the house to be empty. He had no suspicion that the very man he hunted stood only a few feet away. The faint light from Baker Street entered through the dusty window, revealing just enough for me to make out his outline. He was taller than average, broad across the shoulders, and carried himself with surprising strength despite his deliberate caution. His overcoat hung open, exposing evening clothes beneath. As though he had recently left some respectable gathering, an opera hat rested far back upon his head. The most striking feature, however, was his face. As he crouched near the window, the light briefly touched his profile. His forehead was high and nearly bald. A heavy gray mustache framed a firm mouth. Deep lines crossed his weathered face, giving it an appearance both stern and dangerous. His eyes shone with an intensity that immediately caught my attention. They were not the restless eyes of an ordinary criminal, but the steady gaze of a man accustomed to patience, discipline, and deadly precision. Even before I knew his name, I sensed that Holmes had chosen his words carefully when he described this man as his most dangerous surviving enemy. The stranger never glanced toward us. Every part of his attention remained fixed upon the window overlooking Baker Street. He moved with remarkable confidence, clearly familiar with the purpose of his visit. Only then did I notice the object he carried. At first glance resembled nothing more than a walking stick. He laid it gently upon the bare floor. Instead of the dull sound of wood, however, there came a distinct metallic note. The stranger knelt beside it. From within his overcoat, he removed another carefully wrapped object. Working calmly and without haste, he joined the two pieces together. Several quiet clicks echoed through the empty room as hidden mechanisms locked into place. I watched with growing astonishment. Before my eyes, the innocent-looking walking stick slowly transformed into a most unusual firearm. Its shape differed greatly from any rifle I had previously seen. The stock appeared strangely formed. The barrel was slender and unusually long. Its construction suggested remarkable craftsmanship. Most curious of all, the man handled the weapon with the effortless confidence of someone who had used it countless times before. Holmes remained motionless beside me. Only the slight tightening of his hand upon my arm revealed the importance of what we were witnessing. The stranger completed his preparations with astonishing efficiency. He opened the breech, inserted a single projectile, closed the mechanism with another soft click, and he settled himself comfortably before the window. Every movement possessed quiet precision. There was no nervousness, no unnecessary haste. He had come here expecting success. Resting the barrel upon the window ledge, he carefully adjusted his position. His cheek settled against the stock, one eye closed. The other looked steadily along the sights, following the direction of the barrel. I realized immediately what he intended to shoot. Across Baker Street, the dark silhouette of Sherlock Holmes remained peacefully seated behind the blind. The wax figure had fulfilled its purpose perfectly. The assassin believed he had discovered his target. The stillness that followed seemed almost unreal. No carriage passed. No footsteps echoed along the pavement. Even the wind appeared to pause. The man scarcely breathed. Every muscle remained perfectly controlled. His long mustache rested lightly against the stock of the strange weapon. His fingers settled gently upon the trigger. The entire world seemed to narrow into that single silent moment. Then came the shot, or rather, what should have been a shot. Instead of the deafening report one expects from a rifle, there sounded only a strange rushing whisper through the air. Brief, sharp hiss. Almost immediately afterwards came the clear, silvery crash of breaking glass from across the street. The bullet had struck the window of Baker Street. At the very same instant, Holmes sprang into action. Never before had I seen him move with such astonishing speed. The calm observer vanished. In his place appeared a man whose every movement had been rehearsed 100 times within his mind. He launched himself forward with the speed of a hunting tiger. Before the marksman could recover from firing, Holmes crashed into him from behind. Both men fell heavily to the floor. The rifle slipped sideways. For a brief instant, the struggle became fierce. The stranger possessed extraordinary strength. Recovering almost immediately, he twisted violently and seized Holmes by the throat with powerful hands. The expression upon his face transformed completely. The calm hunter disappeared. In his place stood a desperate man fighting for freedom. Without hesitation, I rushed forward. There was no time for careful thought. Holding my revolver firmly by its barrel, I struck the attacker sharply across the head with the heavy butt. The blow broke his grip. He collapsed once more upon the floor. Immediately I threw my weight upon him, pinning his arms, while Holmes recovered his footing. Even then the man struggled fiercely. His strength was astonishing for someone of his age. Every movement revealed years of physical discipline. Had Holmes faced him alone, the contest might have proved considerably longer. Instead, within moments, the advantage belonged entirely to us. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a small whistle. One clear, piercing note echoed through the empty house. Almost instantly the silence outside vanished. Running footsteps thundered across the pavement. The front door burst open. Several men hurried inside. Within seconds, uniformed policemen entered the room, accompanied by a plainclothes detective, whom I immediately recognized. It was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. His familiar face showed unmistakable satisfaction as he took in the remarkable scene before him. Without wasting a moment, 2 constables seized the prisoner, while Holmes calmly stepped aside. The struggle had ended almost as quickly as it began. The dangerous marksman, moments earlier so certain of success, now stood firmly restrained between 2 powerful policemen. Only then did I fully appreciate the elegance of Holmes's entire plan. Everything had unfolded almost exactly as he intended. The wax figure had tempted the assassin into revealing himself. The abandoned house had provided the perfect place from which to watch. The police had waited nearby, ready to enter the instant Holmes gave the signal. Even so, Holmes admitted later that one small detail had surprised him. He had expected the assassin to fire from somewhere outside in Baker Street. Instead, the man had secretly entered the empty house opposite, choosing a position that offered an even clearer view of the window. Fortunately, Holmes had anticipated every possibility except the exact location. The trap had still succeeded. The room gradually grew brighter as lanterns were uncovered. Holmes closed the open window to prevent unnecessary attention from gathering outside. The broken glass across Baker Street glimmered beneath the gaslight. Some curious passers-by had already begun slowing to examine the disturbance, though none yet understood what had occurred. Our prisoner no longer resisted. Instead, he stood breathing heavily between the constables. His face remained stern, but his eyes had changed. They no longer held confidence. Instead, they rested upon Holmes with an extraordinary mixture of hatred, disbelief, and unwilling admiration. It was the look of a man who had believed his enemy dead for years, only to discover that he himself had been outwitted. For several moments, he simply stared. At last, almost under his breath, he muttered a few bitter words. He called Holmes a fiend, not with fear, not with anger alone, but with reluctant respect for the brilliant mind that had once again escaped death and reversed the hunt upon its hunter. Holmes, however, displayed neither triumph nor cruelty. He merely adjusted his collar, which had become disordered during the struggle, and regarded the prisoner with the calm courtesy that so often unsettled hardened criminals. The true explanation, I knew, had not yet been revealed. The identity of the mysterious marksman, his connection to Ronald Adair, and the reason Holmes had waited 3 years for this very night were still waiting to be uncovered. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. The room remained silent for several moments after the struggle ended. Only the steady breathing of the prisoner and the faint crackle of lantern flames disturbed the quiet. The policemen held their captives securely, while Inspector Lestrade looked from Holmes to the unusual air rifle lying upon the dusty floor. His expression revealed equal measures of satisfaction and curiosity. Even after years of working alongside Sherlock Holmes, Lestrade had learned that the conclusion of an arrest often marked only the beginning of the true explanation. Holmes stooped calmly and lifted the strange weapon from the floor. He handled it with obvious care. "This," he remarked quietly, "is one of the most ingenious instruments ever constructed for taking a human life." Lestrade examined it closely. At first glance, it resembled no firearm with which I was familiar. Its workmanship was extraordinarily fine, almost elegant, despite its deadly purpose. There was no ordinary firing mechanism, no obvious hammer, and no signs that would attract attention if carried discreetly beneath an overcoat. Holmes explained that the weapon had been specially designed by a blind German mechanic of remarkable skill. It possessed one extraordinary advantage. Unlike a conventional rifle, it discharged its projectile almost silently. Only the faint hiss we had heard betrayed its operation. No thunderous report echoed through the streets. No cloud of smoke announced the marksman's position. To anyone nearby, the breaking of glass might easily seem an accident rather than the result of a carefully aimed shot. Such a weapon, Holmes observed, suited a professional killer perfectly. He laid the rifle gently upon a nearby table. Then, for the first time that evening, he turned his full attention toward the prisoner. The man stood perfectly upright, despite the policeman restraining him. His broad shoulders remained squared. His weathered face betrayed little emotion. Only his eyes revealed the fierce intelligence still burning behind them. Holmes regarded him steadily. "I believe," he said at last, "that there is little purpose in concealing your identity any longer." The prisoner returned the gaze without flinching. There was neither apology nor fear upon his face. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet pride of a soldier who had long ago accepted danger as an ordinary companion. Holmes addressed him by name, Colonel Sebastian Moran. The title immediately caught my attention. I knew the name, not personally, but through reputation. Colonel Moran had once enjoyed considerable distinction within the British Indian Army. He had earned recognition as a courageous officer and an exceptional hunter. Stories of his remarkable marksmanship had traveled widely among military circles. His reputation for bringing down dangerous game from astonishing distances bordered upon legend. To hear such a man accused of murder seemed almost unbelievable. Holmes, however, spoke with complete certainty. He explained that Colonel Moran had served with honor during his younger years. His courage had never been questioned, nor had his remarkable eyesight. Few men alive could equal his skill with a rifle. Unfortunately, extraordinary talent does not always lead a man toward honor. Somewhere during the course of his life, ambition had gradually yielded to greed. Integrity had surrendered to temptation. Holmes observed that men of exceptional ability often possess the capacity for exceptional wrongdoing when their moral judgment fails. Colonel Moran had become precisely such a man. His remarkable gifts eventually attracted the attention of Professor James Moriarty. The professor never surrounded himself with ordinary criminals. He preferred intelligent individuals capable of executing difficult tasks. Among them all, Holmes continued, none proved more valuable than Colonel Moran. Where Moriarty planned, Moran acted. Where silent violence became necessary, Moran possessed both the nerve and the skill to accomplish it. Within that hidden criminal organization, he occupied a position second only to the professor himself. With Moriarty dead, Colonel Moran naturally assumed leadership over those loyal followers who remained. The prisoner neither denied nor confirmed these accusations. He simply watched Holmes with cold, unwavering eyes. His silence itself seemed strangely eloquent. Holmes continued. For 3 years, Colonel Moran had believed Sherlock Holmes dead beneath the Reichenbach Falls. Only one fact prevented complete satisfaction. The colonel himself knew that Holmes had escaped the struggle. He alone had witnessed the detective climbing the rocky cliff. He alone had attempted to crush him beneath falling stones. Thus, although the world believed Holmes dead, Colonel Moran never possessed such certainty. He remained watchful, patient, prepared. The instant rumors reached him that Holmes had returned to Baker Street, he resolved to complete the unfinished work. A determination had brought him to the abandoned house opposite. His remarkable confidence became his greatest weakness. Believing himself the hunter, he failed to imagine that Holmes might already be observing him. Lestrade listened with growing admiration. Though proud of Scotland Yard, he freely admitted that such planning lay beyond the ordinary methods of police investigation. Holmes accepted the compliment with little comment. He preferred facts to praise. The inspector's attention soon returned to another matter. "What about Ronald Adair?" he asked. The question reminded me that the entire evening had begun with that impossible mystery. Holmes nodded. "Precisely," he answered. "Death of Ronald Adair led me back to London." He walked slowly toward the window overlooking Baker Street. Across the road, Mrs. Hudson had wisely extinguished a lamp inside our old sitting room. The broken window reflected only scattered moonlight now. Holmes rested one hand upon the dusty window frame. "Mr. Adair," he began, "was an unfortunate young gentleman whose honesty placed him in great danger." He explained that Ronald Adair frequently played cards within several fashionable London clubs. Among the gentlemen who attended those gatherings was Colonel Moran. The colonel enjoyed an excellent reputation. His military career inspired confidence. Few suspected dishonesty from a man of such distinguished background, yet Holmes had quietly gathered evidence years earlier, suggesting that Moran possessed another remarkable talent. He cheated at cards, not carelessly, not often. Only circumstances appeared completely safe. His methods proved subtle enough to escape ordinary observation. Over time, however, substantial sums accumulated through deception. Holmes believed Ronald Adair had eventually discovered the truth. Exactly how the discovery occurred remained uncertain. Perhaps he noticed irregularities during play. Perhaps simple chance revealed the pattern. The original evidence could no longer be recovered with certainty. What mattered was the inevitable consequence. Ronald Adair, being an honorable man, refused to continue participating under such conditions. Holmes believed he confronted Colonel Moran privately rather than exposing him publicly. The young gentleman likely offered the older man an opportunity to withdraw quietly from club life. Such conduct matched Adair's well-known character. Unfortunately, honor sometimes proved dangerous when confronting desperate men. Exposure would have destroyed Colonel Moran completely. His reputation, his income, his social standing, everything depended upon silence. Instead of accepting disgrace, he chose murder. Using the specially constructed air rifle, he watched Ronald Adair through the open window of his home in Park Lane. The distance presented little difficulty for a marksman of Moran's extraordinary ability. The silent weapon allowed him to fire without alarming anyone nearby. The bullet struck its victim with fatal accuracy. Moments later, the colonel departed unnoticed. The locked door inside the room naturally confused investigators. Everyone searched for a murderer who had entered the house. In reality, no one had entered at all. The shot came through the open window. Simple, elegant, almost impossible to imagine. Only a hunter possessing Colonel Moran's astonishing precision could have attempted such a feat. Holmes turned once more toward the prisoner. For the first time, a faint smile crossed Colonel Moran's lips. It was not the smile of a defeated man. Rather, it suggested reluctant admiration. He recognized that Holmes alone had untangled the mystery. No ordinary detective would likely have suspected an air rifle fired across the street. The colonel's silence continued. Holmes seemed entirely satisfied with that. There are occasions, he observed quietly, when silence speaks more clearly than any confession. Lestrade ordered the constables to prepare the prisoner for transport. As they led Colonel Moran toward the door, he paused only once. His eyes met Holmes'. Neither man spoke. Yet within that single glance rested years of pursuit, rivalry, and mutual understanding. Professor Moriarty had once called Holmes the only man capable of defeating him. Looking upon Colonel Moran, I could not help believing the colonel now shared that opinion. The door closed behind the policeman. Their footsteps gradually faded into the sleeping streets. At last, the empty house fell quiet once more. Holmes picked up the remarkable air rifle one final time before handing it carefully to Lestrade as evidence. The investigation had reached its conclusion, yet one chapter still remained unwritten. For although Colonel Moran now stood in police custody, Holmes still owed me the final details of his extraordinary return from the dead and the quiet homecoming to Baker Street that had restored our friendship at last. When the policeman had departed with Colonel Sebastian Moran, the deserted house seemed strangely peaceful once again. Only Inspector Lestrade remained with us. He stood beside the dusty table where the remarkable air rifle rested, examining it with open fascination. Even after witnessing countless investigations during his career, the events of that night had clearly astonished him. Holmes quietly brushed the dust from his sleeves. Apart from a slight mark upon his collar, where Colonel Moran had seized him during the struggle, he appeared almost entirely untroubled by the encounter. His calmness never ceased to amaze me. Only minutes earlier he had faced one of the most dangerous men in England. Now he behaved as though he had merely concluded an ordinary evening's work. Lestrade broke the silence. "My congratulations, Mr. Holmes," he said sincerely. "I freely admit that Scotland Yard could never have solved this affair without your assistance." Holmes accepted the compliment with characteristic modesty. "You have your prisoner," he replied. "That is the important matter." The inspector smiled. "It is considerably more than a prisoner," he answered. "If your suspicions prove correct, we have captured one of the most dangerous criminals in the country." Holmes merely inclined his head. He had never sought recognition. The successful conclusion of a case always satisfied him far more than public praise. Lestrade soon departed to supervise the official proceedings. The air rifle accompanied him as evidence. Once the sound of their footsteps disappeared into Baker Street, Holmes and I found ourselves alone within the abandoned house. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to relax. He looked around the empty room with quiet satisfaction. "The danger has finally ended," he observed. There was genuine relief in those simple words. For 3 years, Holmes had lived beneath the constant shadow of a patient and relentless enemy. Now that shadow had vanished. Together we left the deserted building through the same rear entrance by which we had entered earlier. The cool night air felt wonderfully fresh after the dusty silence of the empty rooms. London appeared almost asleep. Only an occasional cab passed beneath the gas lamps. The city knew nothing of the remarkable contest that had just ended within one forgotten house. Holmes suggested that we walk slowly back toward Baker Street. I gladly agreed. At the very excitement of the evening, the quiet streets seemed especially welcome. For several minutes we walked without speaking. At last I turned toward Holmes. "There is still one matter," I said. He smiled immediately. "The complete explanation." I nodded. Although the principal mystery had been solved, several details still remained unclear. Holmes understood exactly which questions occupied my thoughts. He began walking more slowly. "A case of Ronald Adair," he said, "appeared impossible only because investigators searched in the wrong direction." He explained that every officer naturally assumed the murderer must have entered the locked room. The locked door became the center of the investigation. Yet Holmes had deliberately ignored it. Instead, he examined the window. That single difference transformed the entire problem. The open window overlooked Park Lane. An exceptionally skilled marksman positioned outside could fire directly into the room. No visitor would be required. No footprints. No forced entry. No escape from a locked chamber. The impossible mystery disappeared at once. I remarked that few men could have accomplished such a shot. Holmes agreed immediately. That fact had proved decisive. An ordinary criminal would never attempt it. The distance alone discouraged such speculation. Only someone possessing extraordinary confidence in his own marksmanship would even consider the possibility. The list of such men was remarkably short. Among them all, one individual stood above every other: Colonel Sebastian Moran. Holmes confessed that the moment he read newspaper reports describing Ronald Adair's death, the colonel's name entered his thoughts almost instinctively. The unusual method resembled no common crime. It reflected the habits of an expert hunter. From that point onward, the remaining evidence gradually arranged itself. The victim's connection with fashionable card clubs, Colonel Moran's frequent attendance at those same establishments, rumors of dishonest gambling, which Holmes had quietly gathered years before. Each fact supported the next. Together they formed a clear picture. "What first convinced you?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Human nature." Seeing my puzzled expression, he continued. He explained that exceptionally clever criminals often rely too heavily upon the originality of their methods. They assume investigators will admire the mystery instead of questioning its foundation. Colonel Moran believed the locked door would occupy every detective's attention. Accordingly, no one would examine the possibility of a shot fired through the open window. That assumption nearly succeeded. Only by refusing to accept the obvious explanation could the truth emerge. Holmes paused briefly as we crossed the quiet street. The familiar outline of Baker Street stretched peacefully before us. Mrs. Hudson had already extinguished the lights. The broken pane of glass remained visible beneath the moonlight, silent evidence of the night's remarkable events. Holmes looked toward it thoughtfully. "I owe Hudson a considerable debt," he remarked. I readily agreed. Her role had demanded uncommon courage. Remaining alone inside Baker Street, while knowing that a murderer watched the house, required far greater bravery than many people would imagine. Holmes spoke warmly of her loyalty. She had carried out every instruction perfectly. Each quarter hour she had quietly altered the position of the wax figure without allowing her own shadow to appear upon the blind. Her careful movements had maintained the illusion until the very moment Colonel Moran fired. Without her assistance, the trap might easily have failed. As we approached the familiar doorway of 2021B Baker Street, memories crowded my thoughts once more. 3 years earlier, I had believed these rooms forever abandoned. Now every familiar stone seemed to welcome Holmes home again. Mrs. Hudson herself greeted us with visible relief. She had endured a long and anxious evening. The sound of the air rifles striking the window had undoubtedly frightened her, despite knowing precisely what Holmes expected. She seemed far happier to see us safely returned than interested in discussing the night's excitement. Holmes thanked her with genuine warmth. Few people received such open appreciation from him. Mrs. Hudson certainly deserved it. Soon afterwards, we climbed the familiar staircase together. How often had I ascended those very steps during years gone by? Tonight, each creaking board stirred pleasant recollections. Nothing essential had changed. The sitting room remained exactly as I remembered it. The chemical apparatus occupied its accustomed place. Books lined the shelves. The violin rested quietly upon the chair beside the fireplace. Only one object appeared particularly unusual. The wax figure still occupied Holmes's armchair. Seen nearby, it remained astonishingly lifelike. The bullet had shattered the window only inches away. Had the figure been real, the shot would unquestionably have proved fatal. Holmes removed the dressing gown and examined the damaged curtain with quiet interest. "The Colonel has lost none of his skill," he observed. Even in victory, Holmes remained fair toward his opponent. He never underestimated ability, even when displayed by a criminal. The wax bust itself escaped serious damage. Holmes regarded it with quiet satisfaction. "It has earned an honorable retirement," he remarked, with one of his rare smiles. I laughed softly. The strange companion had indeed performed its duty remarkably well. Holmes settled once more into his old armchair. For a few peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. The room seemed wonderfully familiar. Outside, London continued sleeping beneath the flooding night. Within those comfortable walls, it almost seemed as though the past 3 years had vanished entirely. At length, Holmes reached for his pipe. The familiar movement completed the picture so perfectly that I could scarcely believe my own eyes. Everything appeared exactly as it had before the tragedy at the Reichenbach Falls. Yet one profound difference remained. The greatest enemy Sherlock Holmes had ever faced was gone forever. Professor Moriarty had perished beside the waterfall. Colonel Moran now sat in police custody. The long campaign against that extraordinary criminal organization had finally reached its conclusion. Holmes looked thoughtfully into the fire. "The game," he said quietly, "has at last been brought to its proper end." Listening to those words, I realized that I had witnessed the closing chapter for one of the greatest struggles ever fought between justice and organized crime. It had begun years earlier with Professor Moriarty. It had ended tonight with a silent shot fired through a Baker Street window. Little did I know, however, that Sherlock Holmes's remarkable career was far from over. Many adventures still awaited us, and before long I would once again find myself recording the astonishing exploits of the world's greatest consulting detective for future generations. The first light of morning had not yet reached the rooftops of London, when silence finally settled over Baker Street. The extraordinary events of the evening were behind us. Colonel Sebastian Moran, The last and most dangerous follower, Professor Moriarty, was in police custody. The mysterious death of Ronald Adair had been explained. The years of uncertainty surrounding Sherlock Holmes's disappearance had finally come to an end. Yet, for me, the greatest joy of that remarkable night had little to do with the arrest itself. It was simply this: my friend had returned. I sat quietly beside the fire, while Holmes refilled his pipe with the familiar care that had always characterized even his smallest habits. Watching him perform such an ordinary task filled me with an unexpected feeling of peace. Only that very afternoon, I had believed Sherlock Holmes to have been dead for 3 years. Now it seemed as though those lonely years had dissolved into nothing more than a troubled dream. Holmes noticed my thoughtful expression. "I fear, Watson," he said with a gentle smile, "that tonight has placed a considerable strain upon your patience." I laughed softly. "My patience has been rewarded beyond anything I could have imagined," he nodded. "I had hoped you would think so." For a little while we allowed the quiet to speak for us. The familiar sitting room looked almost exactly as it had before the terrible events at the Reichenbach Falls. Books still crowded every shelf. Chemical bottles reflected the soft glow of the fire. Holmes' violin rested in its usual place beside the chair. Every object seemed to welcome its owner home. Only the shattered window reminded us that danger had visited Baker Street only hours before. Mrs. Hudson soon entered, carrying a tray with fresh tea. Her face, so anxious throughout the evening, now showed unmistakable relief. She apologized for interrupting us, but Holmes rose immediately to thank her. "My dear Miss Hudson," he said warmly, "I believe your courage has contributed as much to this evening's success as anything I myself have done." The faithful housekeeper seemed almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I only did as you asked, Mr. Holmes, and did it perfectly." Holmes rarely offered praise without reason. When he did, every word carried genuine meaning. Mrs. Hudson smiled quietly before leaving us to our conversation once more. As the door closed, I looked again toward the wax figure that had played such a remarkable part in the night's events. Holmes had placed it against the wall after removing his dressing gown. Even in the brighter light of the room, it remained astonishingly lifelike. The careful modeling of the face, the sharp outline of the nose, the familiar shape of the head, everything combined to create an almost perfect likeness. "Deceived even me," I admitted. Holmes examined the figure with obvious satisfaction. "It only needed to deceive one particular gentleman, and it succeeded completely." He smiled as he remembered Colonel Moran carefully aiming his silent rifle across Baker Street. "Few plans," Holmes admitted, "unfolded exactly as their creator imagined. Unexpected circumstances always arose. Success depended not upon predicting every detail, but upon preparing for several possibilities. That principle had guided the entire operation. His return to London remained secret." The wax figure suggested that Holmes sat peacefully at home. The empty house opposite provided concealment. Lestrade waited nearby with his officers. Mrs. Hudson quietly maintained the illusion. Every separate part appeared almost insignificant. Together they formed a remarkably effective design. I reflected upon the extraordinary patience required. 3 years had passed between Holmes's apparent death and this single evening. Many men would have hurried back to London far sooner. Many would have sought revenge immediately. Holmes had done neither. Instead, he waited. He gathered information. He allowed his enemies to grow confident. Only when every circumstance favored success did he finally act. His greatest victories, I realized, rarely depended upon sudden brilliance alone. They rested equally upon discipline, patience, preparation. Those qualities often distinguished Holmes far more than his famous powers of deduction. As though sensing my thoughts, Holmes leaned comfortably into his chair. "People frequently imagine," he observed, "that detection consists of discovering brilliant explanations." I listened with interest. "In reality," he continued, "it more often consists of refusing to accept convenient ones." Those words remained with me long afterward. The death of Ronald Adair had appeared impossible because everyone accepted the obvious assumptions. A locked door suggested a murderer inside the room. Holmes simply asked whether that assumption deserved belief. From that single question, the truth gradually emerged. His methods had never depended upon magic, only careful observation, clear reasoning, and an unwillingness to overlook small details. The fire burned lower. Outside, the darkness slowly gave way to the first pale signs of dawn. A milk cart rattled faintly somewhere along the distant street. Another ordinary London morning approached. The city would soon awaken to astonishing newspaper headlines. Readers would learn that Colonel Sebastian Moran had been arrested, would discover that the mysterious Park Lane murder had finally been solved. Most astonishing of all, they would read that Sherlock Holmes, believed dead for 3 years, had returned. I smiled at the thought. London itself would scarcely know how to react. Clients who had long abandoned hope would undoubtedly return. Criminals who had celebrated Holmes's death would suddenly discover that their greatest adversaries still lived. The balance between law and crime had shifted overnight. Holmes appeared almost amused by the prospect. "I suspect," he remarked quietly, "that several gentlemen will experience a rather uncomfortable breakfast." Knowing London's criminal world as well as I did, I could only agree. For years, many had acted without fear of Sherlock Holmes. That confidence had vanished before sunrise. After another thoughtful silence, Holmes reached for his violin. Without speaking, he tightened one string slightly before drawing the bow gently across it. A soft melody drifted through the quiet room. It possessed none of the excitement that had accompanied our adventure. Instead, it carried a peaceful, reflective quality, perfectly suited to the calm that followed danger successfully overcome. I listened without interruption. The music seemed to close one chapter of our lives, while quietly opening another. For myself, I already knew one task awaited. These remarkable events deserved to be recorded. The world knew Sherlock Holmes only through rumors, newspaper reports, and the occasional sensational account written by others. I possessed something far more valuable. I had stood beside him. I had witnessed the truth. One day I would place these events upon paper exactly as they had happened, preserving them for future readers. Holmes smiled when I mentioned the thought. "I suspected as much." "You have no objection?" "My only request," he replied, "is that you continue showing greater interest in facts than in dramatic embellishment." I laughed. "You know me better than that." "Indeed I do." That simple exchange reminded me how naturally our friendship had returned. 3 years had separated us, yet within a single evening the old companionship seemed entirely restored. It was as though we had merely resumed a conversation interrupted only yesterday. Outside, daylight strengthened steadily. The lamps along Baker Street were extinguished one by one. Shopkeepers began preparing their windows. Carriages increased upon the roads. London awakened, unaware that history had quietly changed during the night. Before leaving Baker Street that morning, I paused upon the familiar staircase. Looking back, I saw Holmes standing beside the window, watching the busy street below with thoughtful eyes. The great consulting detective had come home. Many extraordinary adventures still lay before him. Many strange mysteries still waited to challenge his remarkable mind. And I knew with quiet happiness that I would once again have the privilege of walking beside my friend, recording those adventures for generations yet to come. Thus ended the remarkable affair of the Envelry Femme. Not merely the solution of Ronald Adair's mysterious death, but the triumphant return of Sherlock Holmes after years in the shadows. It marked the close of one great struggle and the beginning of many more adventures, proving once again that truth, however deeply hidden, can always be found by those with the patience to seek it.